Commissioner Shepherd, can you hear me? We can't hear you.
You can now.
Yes, we can. Everybody is here for when you're ready to open proceedings for the afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming in. We have a few submissions to hear this afternoon, but we've ample time to hear everything that you want to say. I think we start with the submission of MacKenzie District Council, and who is representing them, please?
I am Jeff Haller from MacKenzie District Council.
Your name again?
Jeff Haller.
Waller.
Haller, H-O-R-L-E-R.
Thank you. Now, if you have the original submission, we have already got that, and we're grateful to you for it. And in particular, we've got particular interest in the matters that are set out in pages 4 and 5. But we have read it all, and you now have the opportunity, which we are glad that you're taking, of speaking to the whole of the submission.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to the submission. MacKenzie District Council supports everything that's been laid out in the minimum flows and that, but what we did have as concern was the point at which minimum flows are and restrictions apply to a community. For an example, in the old one, and I can only use the old one fairly, for example, if something happened at State Highway 8 or State Highway 1 at Temuka, and then fairly has to put on restrictions, it's very hard to get the community to understand why when the set point is so far away, 80 to 100 kilometres away from the town. So what we're submitting is that we'd like a point that's more relative to the community, in which its restrictions may be imposed, it will comply, and it will get a better buy-in by that community. There is 2 points already within the MacKenzie that could quite easily work for Fairlie or Burke's Pass or even Albury, and they're Cloudy Peaks and Rockwood, which are flowed. And then it would also, by using those, we then take away the messy thing of unmodified flows, which is a device that's worked out behind the scenes by ECAN, and that we have to apply by, which takes into account water holdback by the dam, the river flows and everything else, and the communities don't get to see that, so then they don't understand why it's different to what is on the ECAN website. So that's basically what the submission is that we would like to see set points for restrictions be more relative to the community that those restrictions are going to apply to.
Thank you very much. That's a superb summary of the main points. Thank you. Now, I don't think I managed to note all of the suggested reference points. You suggested Fairlie or Burke's Pass.
No, those are the communities. What I'm saying is, for those communities, there are 2 flow monitoring devices on the Opahi River that are in place now, and one of them is called Cloudy Peaks, and the other one is called Rockwood.
Right.
And those would be more appropriate for flows at those points for the community of Fairlie or Burke's Pass if restrictions come into place.
I've got it. Yes, thank you. I hadn't quite got that grasped clearly, and thank you for that. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions to ask of Mr. Haller?
Have you discussed that suggestion with Opua Water Limited or with some of the working parties that have provided extensive evidence to us on the existing regime?
During the initial things, I was a part of the OTOP and that sort of thing, and I've always maintained that that's what we should have. Look, Opal Water, to be fair, they pretty much, where they get their water from has no effect on the towns of Fairlie. So, you know, they're on a different tact. So it's just very difficult, because we had to do it one year, and there's a very hard sell to get the community to buy in when they can't see it themselves. And then they drive from Fairlie down to Timaru to do their shopping and that, and there's irrigators going, and they're not allowed to do anything, and here's all these irrigators going. So very, very hard to sell, and I'm the one that's in the firing line.
Okay. No further questions, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming in, Mr. Waller. It may seem a long way to come for a short conversation, but your submission is so clear and you've presented it so persuasively. Thank you very much for your help.
No, thank you for giving us the chance to talk on it. It's just the one thing that we felt was a little bit unfair, that's all. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Many thanks. Shall we come next to Rooney Earth Moving?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Simon Headley, on behalf of Canterbury. Sorry, let me start that again.
Yes.
There are two submissions you have in front of you. One is from Rooney Earth Moving, and the second is from the South Canterbury gravel extraction industry.
Yes.
I'd like, with your indulgence, to have both of those statements of evidence heard together.
Splendid.
You have a statement of evidence from Managing Director of Rooney Earth Moving, Mr. Gary Rooney, who is also the Chair of the South Canterbury Gravel Extraction Industry, and you have a statement of evidence from myself on behalf of both of those parties.
Splendid. Just a moment and I'll bring those up.
Thank you.
We do.
Thank you.
And which of you would like to go first?
If I might lead off, and then I'll ask Mr. Rooney to make some comments, and we'll open ourselves up to questions.
Splendid.
Firstly, I'd like to confirm that the evidence presented in the statements of evidence has been reviewed in consideration of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management 2020 and the National Environmental Standards for Freshwater 2020. At this point in time, we don't seek to change anything in the statements of evidence. However, as with, I'm sure with Council and with other parties, we are coming to grips slowly with the challenges that those afford us.
I think it may take a little while.
A little while. It keeps us in jobs, I think, yes. The second is I will come to an additional issue relating to the definition of a defence against water structure in the definitions section of Plan Change 7.
Yes, it's the particular part. Do you want to go to that now, or will you just come to that?
If that's all right. Yes, that would be appreciated. So,
which paragraph's that?
So, it comes in under definitions. I'll just turn to it now. It will come in on page 11, section 2.9 under definitions.
I'm obviously not looking at the right thing. I was
Sorry.
looking at your statement of evidence.
No, it's not in the statement of evidence, no.
It's in the submission, is it?
It's a verbal submission I'm giving you, sir.
All right.
reviewing the statements of evidence and reviewing the Plan Change 7, it's been identified that there is an addition to the definition of a defence against water structure.
Yes.
It now includes any recontouring or rebattering of a riverbed, which may have the effect of regulating the flow, energy or spread of water.
Yes.
Gravel extraction includes a condition which requires rehabilitation of the bed of the river. And often the purpose of the consent is to increase the carrying capacity of the river body. Including recontouring and rebattering as a defence against water structure, when it's simply not, it's simply part of the rehabilitation of a consent, leads to the potential of an additional consent required for gravel extractors, with the additional set of fees associated with it. For an activity which is required by a condition of the gravel extraction consent, depending on how that definition is interpreted by the consent planner. It would be our submission that recontouring and rebattering of the bed of a river associated with consented gravel extraction is just that, a consented activity, either as a permitted activity under 5.149 or as required by a resource consent. And the inclusion of those four words adds significantly to a potential burden on a gravel extractor. It does tie to a degree with the submission we've made regarding a rehabilitation plan in the submissions. So we also do not believe that a rehabilitation plan is the appropriate tool. It becomes too prescriptive when we're dealing with braided rivers.
Dynamic and time.
Correct. And puts an implication that we may have some form of replanting or something similar, which is certainly not in the context of gravel extraction. I've no further comments. I'll ask Mr. Rooney, on behalf of both Rooney Earthmoving and on behalf of South Canterbury Gravel Extraction Industry, to make any further comments he'd wish.
Good afternoon, sir.
Mr. Rooney, thank you for coming in.
My concern on behalf of the industry here is that I think people forget that the reason that we take gravel out of these rivers is for our communities. The contractor that shifts it and takes it is only passing on the cost of that. So the entire reason for taking gravels is for our community wellbeing. For my period of time in the industry, taking gravels from rivers, we're doing a public service, taking it out where it needs to come out, or in the restrictive days of today it wouldn't happen. But also it's getting harder and harder and harder, sir, and the people that actually carry out this industry are laymen. And so we get to the extent these days where, you know, it's consent on top of consent, it's rules on top of rules, and they're all subject to interpretation. And the reality of that is it's just getting too hard. And council officers and planners lose sight of the practicality of some of these things when these rules are imposed on the industry. A couple of examples I'll give you, sir, is in a couple of the rules here at the moment. So, in order to be catch-all, they make comments like, or any indigenous freshwater species habitat. Okay. New Zealand has such a vibrant water ecology that any drop of water sooner or later ends up with an indigenous species in it, whether it's a drain, a wetland, a river, or a lake. So, including that in a set of rules catches everything. So you can have a permitted activity that is a permitted activity except for where indigenous species occupy water. Well, there isn't anything that falls outside of that net. So our problems really are, please, can we try and get some simplicity into these things so that the people that actually have to operate under these rules can actually understand them and be governed by them. We've just recently had a circumstance where ECAN have been activating what's that called? Permitted activity throughout all water bodies in our region. And on the 2nd of September, they withdrew that and said that they had reviewed their internal mechanisms, and unless the gravel was being abstracted in a rating district with, say, fully controlled, unless it was the gravel was causing erosion type issues, they would no longer issue permitted activities on those. So now we're back to where, you know, things had freed up a little bit to where it was workable, to where we're back to applying for full consents in any areas outside of rating districts. So again, we come back to the fact that, you know, if the community requires this gravel to be removed to retain the status of our rivers, if it gets too hard, sir, we'll all be operating off land. So that would be detriment to everybody. That's all I've got to say, please. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you for the clear description.
With your permission, the issues that
Yes, Mr. Head.
the issues that Mr. Rooney was referring to with regard to indigenous freshwater species are referred to in both my and Mr. Rooney's submissions in terms of Rule 5.136. In my submissions, it's on pages 5 and 6.
Yes.
And in Mr. Rooney's, it is on pages 4 and 5. Over the page to the top of last paragraph, first paragraph on page 6, paragraph 37.
Yes, I can see it here. Thank you. Thank you for that. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions for these gentlemen?
No questions of clarification. Thank you. The points you've made are clearly set out.
Thank you.
Well, we understand what you're on about, and we thank you for coming in and also for sending us the fuller statements typed up that we've already been able to. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Next Next, I think it's Great Southern Deer Farms. Now, I think we had two submissions, but they're the same virtually, aren't they?
From Great Southern Deer Farm?
Yes. Is that right?
Yeah.
So,
I'm the
who's
one.
going to...
I've drawn the short straw of talking to it.
Splendid. And just give us your name again.
And I'm Abby France.
Thank you.
I'm
Will
going to say
you
it
put
again 'cause
one
I've
of
got-
those submissions?
Okay.
And, we welcome you here, and we're interested to hear what you would like to say to present this submission to us.
Okay. Good afternoon. As I said, my name's Abby France, and today I'm seeking reassurance from you. Reassurance that our extensive low-intensity farming areas will not be included in the blanket use of stock exclusion, and the region-wide provisions on livestock exclusion also applying to intermittently flowing springs and artificial watercourses with surface water in them. My concern is that without clear definitions of what intensive and extensive low-intensity farming is, there is a provision by omission to not include these areas. This does not provide certainty for farming businesses and leaves the policy open to interpretation. Through the use of clear definitions using either stocking rate or paddock size, clarity could be given to ensure that farmers have certainty about the continued viability of these farming areas. The exclusion of these areas from the policy will not have a negative impact on water quality, as farmers can achieve great water quality through good management practices that many of them have been applying for over 100 years already. Today is an opportunity for you to give us that reassurance. Great Southern Deer Farms was formed in 2012. Our why? To pool our equity and expertise to achieve scale and profitability that we would not have been able to obtain as individuals. The farming business consists of a mixture of land and soil types, including downland intensive finishing farmland and hill country tussock land used for breeding. The Great Southern Deer Farms team are passionate about the deer industry and the community. As a team, we hold several positions in industry and community groups. Personally, I have been involved with the Rural Support Trust for 9 years, and I work for New Zealand's largest rural insurer, as well as being a mum and owning my own business, just to fill a few waking hours of the day. When I started working in insurance, the main topics of conversation at the table were the politics of the Albury Primary School and the price of butter. Now, I have lots of conversations about the concerns and stresses farmers have about compliance and what the future of farming looks like for the next generation. I can honestly say I walk away from some of those conversations with genuine worries about the welfare of our farming people. Good, honest, hard-working people that feel persecuted in the eyes of the public, and even more so by the regulators that write policy that feels like, whether it was the intention or not, it was written to get them. Firstly, get them forced into the consenting process, and secondly, to get them to stop farming the land altogether. Now, it may not be the intention of the policy writers, but it's how many of these farming families are feeling, and it's heartbreaking. I very rarely have a conversation with a client that sounds like they're proud to be a farmer anymore, despite the fact that many of them have a lot to be proud of. Great Southern Deer Farms, for example, have been working on a farm environmental management plan for nearly 10 years. We've put in over 4 k's of deer fencing to exclude stock from waterways, and we've planted over 1,000 trees across 200 hectares of intensively grazed land in Geraldine. It's cost in excess of $100,000, and none of which makes the business more profitable. However, what we used to refer to as the bull paddock is now a thriving wetland, and we're very proud of what we're achieving. And we intend to continue our efforts to improve into the future, regardless of whether we're regulated or not. But the cost is significant, and it won't happen overnight. Growing up on a farm, I was always taught that farming isn't just about the animals, it's about the beliefs and values passed down through the generations, ensuring things are left better for those yet to come. It's about the legacy. Now, we're not perfect, but we're working hard to improve the land so that our legacy is a good one. We all want the same thing, don't we? Fresh water. The question is, how do we manage and maintain our fresh water? We minimise the risk of animal disease parasites entering the waterway. We do not want to see livestock standing and defecating in the waterways excessively. We ensure that the banks and stream beds are not being trampled and pugged, causing erosion and sediment runoff. We reduce the risk of sediment runoff into the waterways. We can do this through stock management, strategic planting of trees and pasture management. The management and grazing of these areas can in many cases improve the quality of the waterways through the control of pests and weeds that contribute to erosion, far beyond examples seen in areas retired from farming. And the main one, I think, you cannot be green if you're in the red. Farming businesses need the ability to create income, and this is something they should not be made to feel ashamed of. I'm sure all of you would be looking for a new employer if your paycheck wasn't coming through. There seems to be a perception in the community that farmers have huge farm surpluses, and this is simply not the case. Environmental initiatives are a long-term commitment costing large amounts of money and time. Many farms have made this commitment without blanket regulations and should be applauded for the work that they do and continue to do. What do I define low intensity farming as? Low intensity means farm properties that contain no more than 8 stock units per hectare. Why do we ask that low intensity farming areas are excluded from these provisions? Because what we were doing is working well to protect intermittently flowing springs already. Many of these extensive hill country areas have been grazed for over 100 years, and there isn't a creek I wouldn't fill my water bottle from. Many of these springs supply house water to the families that live there, and most of you probably have to pay $4 to get your hands on a bottle of it. To address the concerns that regulators may have about the impact that deer in particular may have on springs and waterways, I think it is important to explain the natural behaviour of deer. Wallowing is a natural behaviour, and access to wallows probably improves the well-being of farmed red deer. It's impossible to completely deny red deer access to wallows. They simply create them to meet their innate need to wallow. Intermittently flowing springs are not where you will see these wallows created. In most cases, these springs will be used by deer as a source of drinking water only. Many of these springs are steep, rocky areas, and the creek beds are stony, not making for a great wallow at all. Livestock standing in water for long periods of time can lead to the degradation of waterways. Deer and hill-run cattle alike tend to camp on high ground rather than hang out in a creek. They tend to browse and graze and only visit a spring or waterway to access drinking water. Low stocking rates reduce the overall pressure on land. Our experience with deer is that wallowing and fence pacing are the most significant risk to water quality. Both of these are reduced by reducing stress and pressure on the animals. The low stocking rate of expansive low-intensity farming areas achieves water quality objectives by default. Blanket regulation is not required to achieve what has been happening for generations. No one has the level of understanding of the ecological balance quite like the people that manage these areas today. It is important to note too that many, and certainly all of the farms in our Woodbury Deer Industry Environment Group, already have farm environmental management plans that they're more than happy to show any of you if you care to ask, and have been actively working on managing water quality for many years without the need for regulation or consent. Why is it so important to make sure that we have this clarification? Because there is a lot at stake. The potential costs of having to exclude stock from these intermittently flowing springs would be significant and extend far beyond financial cost. It is clear that extensive low-intensity farming areas should not be included in the provision 14.4.15, but the omission of any sort of definition or clarification is a scary proposition. These springs and waterways are extremely difficult to identify and change their flows and location often. Excluding deer from intermittent springs is impractical unless permanent fencing is used, and it would not be economic, practical or conducive to better water quality outcomes to fence these areas. If stock exclusion was enforced in these low intensity farming areas, there are several challenges farmers would face to be compliant. There would be costs that would start before a post was even purchased, let alone driven into the ground. Firstly, the research involved in identifying where these intermittent springs are, when they flow, how much and how often they change, and what happens to them during a storm or drought event would be significant. The locations that we are talking about are often extremely remote, high and hard to access, and for that reason we simply don't see them every day to know a lot about how these springs or waterways behave. We simply know that the water that flows and leaves these properties does so in a pristine condition. So we would have to get that information together to decide which ones would require fencing and where those fences would need to go. There is no doubt another consent would be required to carry out the required earthworks to put these fences in. And I cannot begin to guess at how many ecologists, geologists, engineers and environmental consultants would be rubbing their hands together at the thought of the reports required to file that consent. Then, when the bank was approached to borrow the money to commence the fencing, it would need to be disclosed that the stock carrying capacity and therefore productivity of the land could be significantly reduced once the project was complete. What was once an extensive hill country block with large areas to set stock would now be split into much smaller areas, and large areas would no longer be available to be grazed. The next concern I would have would be the provision of stock water. Firstly, the cost of putting one in could easily be in excess of $100,000, but secondly, the reliability of the water and the potential animal welfare issues faced if it failed. To lift the water to where it needs to be without the ready availability of power or gravity systems and the ongoing maintenance required, especially when there are regular frost events, would be extremely challenging, and that's before an animal decides to kick off with pipe fitting and cause a leak on its own. Let's assume the springs were identified and the consent was issued. Now permanent deer fences need to be put in to exclude the stock from springs and waterways. The cost of these fences is between $22 and $25 per metre, but there's two sides to most creeks, so you can double that. In these extensive farming areas, many kilometres would be required. Due to the location of springs, they would also need to be put in some very steep, rocky and remote areas. We're fencing in these areas generally, we try and put these fences in the paths of least resistance, along ridge lines and through clear areas. However, that's not where the springs are. So we would be asking fencers to take large excavation equipment, tractors and people into areas that would pose significant risk to safety, not to mention the insurance implications. Inevitably, there would need to be some soil disturbance to prepare the fence line. This would create significant sediment runoff, albeit for a short time. However, the amount of this runoff would probably equate to about 100 years of runoff caused by managed livestock in the same area. I believe the short-term impacts would outweigh any benefit of excluding stock in the long term. Once the fences are in, the job is also not complete. The ongoing pest and weed management of the fenced areas would be extremely difficult, Even planting these areas in natives would require massive amounts of maintenance at least twice a year to beat the exotics that thrive in these areas such as gorse, broom and wilding pines. If these fenced areas became dense with vegetation, they also become a haven for pigs, rats and wallabies to live and breed. Now I'll put on my insurance hat. If we put fences in these areas that are designed by nature to carry water, and on some occasions a lot of water, then we increase the risk of those fencing materials ending up in the creek. Every time we experience a flood event, and this has a large environmental impact. We don't want these materials in our waterways. But from an insurance perspective, we also don't want to see a time when our fences become uninsurable because the risk is too great for our insurer to underwrite them. These are the types of unintended consequences and challenges that arise from these types of regulations. And in this case, I do not believe any of them actually lead to better water quality outcomes. You can see here I have circled some areas and put some arrows to some certain areas. For the purpose of this presentation, I asked, where would we fence? Sure, the scenery is fit for country calendar, but it's not an easy mountain to climb. As you can see here, these are some easily identifiable areas, but all of them are reasonably hard to access, and I'm not sure, as I say, without more research, whether they in fact would carry water intermittently. So for the purpose of this, I've used the hill stick. It's a farm owned by Great Southern Deer Farms, and I've used it as an example of what the exclusion of stock from intermittent springs would look like for us. The farm was purchased in 2016, and we fenced the boundary in 5 main blocks for the purpose of breeding deer. There are 3 main watercourses that are fed by many springs. These run from the top of the block at 850 metres above sea level and feed down into the Opahi River. The block is stocked with 686 hinds and produces around 650 weaners each year, which equates to a stocking rate of just over 2 per hectare. I'm sure if you went up there this afternoon, you may not actually even see a deer. There are great examples of snow tussock, native bush, and the water runs cool, clear and deep, just as you ask. It is described as a magic spot by anyone who visits. So what would it cost? As you can see, the project would be huge, and it would cost a lot. So much that the block would no longer be economic. I have estimated the length of fencing required to be 30.4 kilometres. This only takes in the large springs that stay in one place and are easy to identify. However, I am sure that with more observation, there would be many more that should be included. The other unknown consequence of putting this fence in is how that would move the stock pressure. Would it actually cause more pacing as we split these blocks and alter the way that the deer naturally behave in the area? From our experience of fencing in 2016, there would not be enough deer posts in New Zealand to order to complete this project. They would need to be manufactured, especially taking many months. It took over 6 months for us to acquire the 6,000 posts for the boundary fence and have them delivered to site. And we are just one farm. So if you do put this through, I recommend that you all rush out and buy shares in a post company. This block produces on average 650 weaners each year. With a current value of $3 per kilo of live weight, the total income produced from this property is $97,650. We still have to take from that 2 sets of helicopter mustering, staff, animal health, rates, insurance, and the list goes on. So in terms of money left in the bank, it's not a lot. The reality of having to exclude livestock from springs and waterways would be all of that income, not profit, total income for 7 years. Now, how many of you would be able to, let alone be prepared to, give up every dollar you earn for the next 7 years to comply with a rule that you don't believe will achieve better water quality? It's a pretty hard sell to tell me that that's a good idea. As you can see, fencing in these areas is tough. These photos are from when we replaced the old sheep fences with deer fences at Hillstick. Thankfully, we had an amazing crew that had a combined fencing experience of over 50 years. We had one of the driest winters in years, and the fence lines were already there. It was still a huge undertaking, and it took 12 months. The impact on the farming business was significant, and I'm sure anyone that has undertaken development of any kind will tell you that getting on with business as usual is nearly impossible when the suppliers are calling, decisions need to be made, the goalposts are constantly moving on you, and the money seems to only be flowing in one direction. The scale of the project was mind-blowing, but stock exclusion fencing would be on a whole other level. So what I'm asking from you today is reassurance. We oppose the blanket use of stock exclusion for the region-wide provisions on livestock exclusion applying to these intermittently flowing springs. We ask for clear definitions of what intensive and what extensive or low intensity farming is. We'd like you to set a stocking rate for the stock exclusion to exclude these low intensity farming areas, and we'd ask that we set that at 8 stock units to the hectare. We'd like for you to provide confirmation and reassurance that stock exclusion rules will not apply to these areas. And we'd also like some recognition of the work that's being done, that water quality objectives can be reached through good management practices rather than blanket regulation, through careful stock management, low stress with low stocking rates, the use of sediment catchments, and the strategic management of pasture and planting. And we believe that our farmers are already doing a lot of these things without the need for regulation, so we ask that that's allowed to be continued.
Well, thank you, Ms. Brants. You've prepared a spirited presentation, and thank you for that. We've been able to follow the graphic parts of your presentation, which you sent to us in advance, but the whole text deserves our attention. And so, as you've got the note of it there, I'm going to ask if you would let us have that so that we can copy it and have that to go through. Will that be all right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, thank you. You've got the notes that you were reading from, and we're grateful for that. Now, before I ask my colleague if he's got any questions, I just want to ask whether you're aware of another perhaps unwelcome step that's been taken in the last few weeks. That was the government's stock exclusion regulations of 2020. Nothing to do with Environment Canterbury, something that came from Wellington. Are you familiar with those?
Yes, we've seen those.
All right, I just wanted you to know, because whatever Environment Canterbury does or doesn't do, the government's regulations will stand. Now, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, do you have any questions to ask Ms. France?
Yes, I do, thank you. Your presentation and your pictures focused on hill country, and I understand the issue is the intermittent springs and streams in the hill country. Does the same concern regarding stock exclusion, particularly for deer, extend to those water bodies on flat land as well, or is it your focus just on the hill country?
Yes, it does extend to those, and Danette's going to talk to that.
So it does extend to flat land as well? And Commissioner Shepherd referred to the Resource Management Stock Exclusion Regs 2020, and of course they do impose obligations on stock exclusion outside of the regional plans. I just wanted to ask you about that, because you've asked for clear definitions in the regional plan. Those regulations have definitions in them of intensively grazed areas. So in the hill country that you're referring to, in terms of the deer farming that's undertaken by yourself, is any break feeding involved?
No.
Any forage crops used?
No.
Any irrigated pasture in that hill country?
No.
Okay.
Only from the sky.
Pardon?
Only from the sky.
Only from the sky. So you wouldn't be intensively grazed under those regulations then, so... Okay. So then my understanding is those regulations probably won't capture you. But anyway, in terms of the stock units per hectare of 8, what's the basis for that?
That is what is in the Hawke's Bay region. There's examples of that nationwide. Also, when we talked about it as a group, I wrote 5 in my original, and then when we thought about this on a more long-term basis, farmers by nature, our genetics are always getting better and our animals are getting bigger, and stock units is a subjective thing. Sometimes it can depend who you talk to as to how they calculate that. So that gives, and 8 is still a relatively low stocking rate.
Sure. I'm just ask about that because a similar issue arose for the Southland Regional Plan that I was involved with, and they set a threshold of 6 stock units per hectare, below which exclusion wouldn't be required on sloping land. So I was just curious about the 8.
I think it would possibly depend on soil type and climate. Southland has got different soils and different rainfalls.
Sure.
I think our hill country around here, 8 is a more realistic, still regarded as low impact.
Sure. So I think I've already asked the Section 42A reporting officers, the council officers, to come back to us on this issue, particularly the interplay between the regulations and the rules. So Mr. McCallum-Clark, when you do that work, can you factor in the approach that was taken in the Southland Regional Plan Rule 70, which I'm sure you're familiar with? And just feed that into your consideration of these issues for us when you report back to us in reply. So I've just asked, we've asked the staff to look at this because it is complicated given what's happened from the central government, and so we've asked the staff to give that some further thought, so we'll just feed that into the mix. But no, thank you for your presentation.
Now, which of you is going to speak to us next in respect of this?
No,
You're going to do slides?
Yeah. I'm sorry to be.
Would you like to? Would you like to introduce yourself first?
I will do. Yes. I kind of have that covered in my slideshow.
It's a secret. Is it? It's a secret.
It's a secret. Yeah, it's a secret until we start. Yeah. Yes, please. Thank you very much. Part of a joint submission, the Woodbury Deer Industry Environment Group and Knocklyn Holdings. Knocklyn Holdings is part of the Environment Group, and we realised that we had pretty much the same submission, so we've combined them, and probably taking up twice as much time as a single submitter, I'm afraid.
We've got the time, just take the time you want.
Thanks. Our group is made up of 11 farm owners, family farms. We run deer and mixed stock farms in the Woodbury area, running from about Woodside to Peel Forest. And generally all of them are in the foothills or the rain shadow of the Southern Alps, so we're not on the plains, we're on the edges. And actually a lot of our farmers are here. I'm not quite sure if you can see the whole courtroom, but we've got Rob and Chris, and we've got Rosa and Graham, we've got Ange and Kerry, we've got my husband Hamish, we've got Graham, we've got Ashley and Sid and Hayden. So we're pretty much all here. There's a few of us that couldn't quite make it.
And your name?
My name is Danette McKeown. I'm a farmer. I farm with my husband. I'm an environmental geologist. I work with the National Environmental Standards and Contaminated Soil. I'm on the DINS Environment Stewardship Reference Group. I'm a member of ALGA, which is Australasian Land and Groundwater Association, Woodbury Board of Trustees, and General Community Busybody, which is why I'm the one up here. Yeah. So our group was formed a couple of years ago, and it was a chance the deer industry offered to provide a facilitator for deer farms to put together a group to help with our farm environment plans, and also just a chance for us to peer review our own environmental practices and look at what worked, what didn't work, share that information, look for innovations. In that time we have had hosted a winter grazing field day. We had ECAN come out with some land management officers. We've undertaken bat monitoring with ECAN. We hosted the Farm Environment Plan Auditors Training Workshop just a couple of weeks ago. That was in association with DINS and ECAN. We've previously opened up our farms to the public so they can get an understanding of the mitigations that we're undertaking. We've had ECAN and Forest and Bird review our riparian margins and effectiveness, and of those that are in the Barkers Creek catchment, some of us are members of the Barkers Creek catchment group, which is part of the OTOP as well. So our farms range from extensive hill country properties like Abby's and Rob's that are maybe stocking units of 2 or 4, to more intensive lowland farms like myself and Hayden, etc. And we might have a stocking rate of 15. So there's quite a variety of farms in that mix. And we already know our why. We know why we're doing this work. There's only a few of us that have consents. I think maybe 2 people out of our group have a consent. But we're already undertaking that work. Most of us are in the permitted. We think we've been working really hard towards trying to protect these waterways. And so I'm not quite sure, I don't have a laser pointer, but hopefully you can see the top figure is from 2006 and the darker green image is from 2020, and you can see the gully running on the diagonal across that has got a lot more planting than it used to have, and probably see a lack of erosion right in the waterway. And that planting constitutes around 7,000 trees planted by myself and my husband, and also the ongoing maintenance, which now that I've started this project is far, far, far harder than the actual planting. The ongoing maintenance is huge. So we're really proud of what we've done. But to put that into scale, the little blue square down there is the little corner of that gully. And we call that Bloke's Gully after one of our past and favourite hunterways who passed away. All of our gullies that get planted out get named after one of our working dogs. And that cost us around $7,200 worth of materials to fence that with the planting and the tree guards. And we've spent around $1,800 of follow-up costs. Generally, we've found we lose around 20 or 30% of the plantings over the 3 years through to frost or drought. We release the trees, we hand release them, we don't spray because we know we've got eels and frogs and things, so it's reasonably labour intensive. The weed control, the gorse, the sycamore, the blackberry, the silver poplar, the elderflower, and that doesn't include our time. And you can see from that it's really the central gully that has been fenced off, and there's another 2 or 3 waterways on this one block. We do have 4 blocks effectively that aren't done yet. And when I first started planting 15 years ago, I anticipated that it would take my lifetime to complete this block. It's, just on ongoing, this has been 15 years and I'm not even a third of the way through. But it has been a significant investment of time and money and effort. And the other thing, I guess, is we're really proud of what we've done. This is Bloke's Gully, which was the one that's in blue. And I think it's looking really good, but I do feel that some of the fun has been sucked out of the work that we do. I don't know what it is about the perverse of human nature, but when someone tells you you must do something that you're already doing, it tends to suck a lot of the fun out of it for you. So that was something that we'd like out of all this, is recognition that there's a lot of really good work already been undertaken. And our group, if you went around our group, you'd find that every one of us has undertaken significant environmental projects. For example, Orari Gorge Station have undertaken a sediment trap, and you can see, well, maybe you can't quite see in that slide, but to deer fence that is a significant project. And also, as Abby alluded to actually deer fence a property is quite different. You're looking at around $45 per metre of waterway. By the time you fence on both sides, you're looking at $22, $23 per metre of fencing if you have to do both sides. So those are things to take into account. We're really lucky in that we have a really active group. All of our members have a farm environment plan, and I believe, I just better clarify that, we call that a farm environment plan, but I don't believe that's a farm environment management plan. So most of us don't have a nutrient budget, but we've been operating them. Mostly we undertook them in association with beef and lamb or the deer industry. They held workshops, but we've kept them up and we're active in maintaining those. And this is actually Kiri's farm environment plan. I just thought it was a really great example because it shows that she's also looking at the biodiversity in the waterways. It's not just about the plantings and looking pretty. Our submission, we're covering the high risk runoff phosphorus zone, the requirements for the consent, the 20 hectare trigger, the inclusion of part of a property. We'd like to discuss some offal pits. We'd like some clarification around intermittent springs and drains, as Abby mentioned. We also have some comments on compliance costs versus environmental outcomes, and also some information about unintended consequences, such as riparian maintenance, intensification and compliance. In the Plan Change 7 proposal, they're proposing that any property greater than 20 hectares in an area that has part of the property located within the high-risk runoff phosphorus zone, the area used for winter grazing of cattle or deer does not exceed 20 hectares. And obviously if you break that rule, then you will require a consent, a farm environment plan as part of that consent as well. We understand that the high-risk phosphorus zone is based on soil type and or topography, and from looking at the ECAN GIS website, it seems to follow the Claremont silty loam, which is a heavy soil, and it's generally on those rolling downlands. I've seen a couple of studies, such David Kelly undertook a study looking at the contaminants coming from the Barkers Creek catchment, where they alluded to the fact that the runoff coming off the clay soils was contributing a lot more phosphorus contamination than, for example, the Waihi River, which was on gravel. And the OTOP Zone Committee memo, which came actually originally from Plan Change 5, noted there's an elevated risk of surface water body contamination from runoff from these high-risk farming activities, particularly those that do not breach the resource consent threshold, which we found really weird, because why are we at any more risk than someone who's got a consent or not? I guess perhaps they felt that they couldn't check up on us because we didn't have that consent, so they weren't able to monitor what we were doing. But as far as I'm concerned, and as a geologist, the highest correlation of P loss comes not from sediment loss, but from having high P in your soils. You're not going to lose phosphorus if there's no P in there anyway. Most of us are marginal, and certainly on the intensive properties, they're not using the P fertiliser like they might be doing in the dairy industry down on the flats. And some of us are intensive and we are using P, but is it really about the high risk phosphorus loss or high risk sediment loss? Our on-farm P losses range from 0.3 to 1.1, which I know from a Massey course, less than 1 is considered low, 1 to 3 is considered moderate, and over 3 is considered high. And every single one of our farms is in that low to moderate bracket. And our individual management blocks within Overseer, they do range from 0.1 to 2, but the 2 comes about not because of the winter feed, it comes about because you tick a box to say that you can say wallows on that block. As soon as I untick that wallows block, it drops down to 1, which is in the low range. And we feel that's consistent with our farming practices, that we're already mitigating P and managing phosphorus losses. I did try some mitigations on Overseer. I took our deer block that sits on the Claremont silty loam. I took out all of the winter feed. I took out all of the tile drains. I took out some of the stock. I took out most of the P fertiliser. And I could not get the P loss in Overseer to change. The only thing that affected it was that ticking the box for wallows. So a lot of those management practices are not really affecting P loss. It's just inherent in the soil. And certainly Graham here, there needs to be recognition that phosphorus can have a geological impact. He's in Totra Valley, and he's got an Olsen P level in his soils of 60 kilograms per hectare, and he's never put P fertiliser on. It's because he's on calcareous soils. So I guess he would be high risk P loss, but it's not through his farming practices. And I felt after looking at the David Kelly study that report didn't take into account geological impacts from phosphorus on these soils either. We know that sediment loss is of higher risk in the high risk phosphorus zone because we farm it, and we've been farming it a long time. And that's why most of us put our cattle in heavier stock classes down on our lighter blocks, and we run our hinds and calves and fawns up on the rolling downlands. In the OTOP memorandum, ECAN acknowledged that strategic grazing of winter fodder crops and management of critical source areas can reduce losses of sediment and phosphorus from winter grazing by 80 or 90%. And yet they still felt that an amendment restricting the winter grazing was the better option. It seemed odd to me as well that the nitrogen risk is currently managed by a prescribed proportional threshold, even though there would be areas down on the plains, for example, where the soils are really free draining and have a very low water holding capacity, which means that nitrogen would easily leach through those soils compared to surrounding soils, and yet they don't have those same restrictive guidelines. In terms of an on-farm example, my understanding of the 20 hectare limit rule means that a 20 hectare farm can have 50% of its farm in winter feed. Knocklyn Holdings, our farm, we'd be able to have 3% of our farm in winter feed, and Arari Gorge Station, which is 4,000 hectares, would be able to have 0.4 of its farm in winter feed. So we manage that soil erosion regardless of how many paddocks are in winter feed. Those good management practices are already applied. We don't ignore some paddocks in preference of others. It costs around $2,500 a hectare to put in fodder beet, and we're not interested in seeing our soil resources and fertiliser inputs run off down the hill either. So there doesn't seem to be any recognition that deer and cattle management practices on winter feed are often very different. And in a study undertaken, EnviroLink noted that pea loss on deer farms can be less than for dairy. We feel we're already mitigating our sediment loss. Pea loss is quite different to nitrogen loss, and if you can mitigate that runoff, you can mitigate that phosphorus. As an alternative to restricting winter grazing, for example, an optimum soil test P provides a really effective way of mitigating pea loss compared to restricting. And I apologise, this next slide isn't in the original PDF that got set on Friday, but it was referenced. It's the McDowell study to the Bay of Plenty Council that looked at the efficacy of pea loss mitigations. And in that you'll notice that the restricted grazing of cropland, it can be effective in that it can mitigate 30 to 50% of the pea, but it comes at quite a high cost. You're looking at $150 to $250 per kilogram of pea conserved, versus an optimum soil test pea where you can save some of your pea and it also saves you money. For example, strategic grazing comes at no cost. It's just the way that you graze your deer across the slope so that your crop remains down slope of your stock. So we feel that there's other effective mitigations without having to restrict. We looked at the S42A statement that ECAN sent out regarding where the thresholds would be sent, and it indicates that various submitters would prefer alternatives, but they do not include evidence supporting their submissions to show that options would deliver the same environmental gains as a 20 hectare restriction. However, I find that one hard to refute. I have not seen anywhere where ECAN have indicated what environmental gains they hope to effect by having a 20 hectare restriction as well. And in some ways I also find it a really ineffective amendment, because it makes common sense that a 4,000 hectare farm is not going to be able to feed their stock on 20 hectares. And even a 600 hectare farm will not be restricting their winter feed to 20 hectares either. So the amendment won't be effective. We won't change how much winter feed we put in. We will put in the winter feed required to feed our animals. All that will happen is we'll get captured in a consent process. And if I was being a little bit cynical and looking at the OTOP memorandum, I would say ideally that's what they were hoping to do. They were hoping that they could inspect our farm environment plans and ensure that we're mitigating the pea loss using management strategies. And this was one way of ensuring that they could check those. But for me, we've all got farm environment management plans, come and ask. So we both want mitigation of pea loss. The other thing that we noted is that I've been really active with the Barkers Creek Catchment Group, and I have never seen any consultation or communication regarding this proposed policy or rule. It was really a big bolt from the blue. So, just as an indication of winter feed going well, and I apologise if I'm going to discuss something like teaching you to suck eggs, but the reason we put winter feed in is because it allows us to feed our animals. Sorry, I'll just get my notes. Average fodder beet crop, for example, you could grow 18,000, maybe 20,000 kilograms of dry matter. None of our farms are irrigated, so we're all dry land crops. But in order to do that with pasture, which we would estimate is around 3,000 or 4,000 kilograms of dry matter, you'd have to farm or winter your stock on 5 or 6 times the amount of area that would be required to put stock on a fodder beet crop over the winter. And we have to have 100 days of feed sitting in front of us going into winter. For example, on our farm, if we decided that we wanted to put all of our stock on pasture, we need around 300 hectares, so over half of our farm would have to be set aside going into autumn when we definitely need that pasture, and then the pasture would get damaged over winter. A large proportion of our farm would get damaged, it would be quite muddy, and then going into spring we'd have a big lapse in our winter feed and our spring production of grass when we need that for our pregnant and lactating animals. So Ange and I, we actually sat down for a couple of hours one day and we tried to look at ways that we could restrict our winter feed, but we seriously couldn't. We ended up trying to always put some more bulk into the pasture and trying to restrict the area that they're on so that we avoid a lot of damage over that winter period. So I just thought I'd point out those are the reasons. We don't just do it because we like seeing mud. We like seeing animals that are really well fed. This is a photo of Ange's farm, and you can see that with deer, we don't put them on big breaks. We often have a 7 to 10 day break, and you can see that the stags in that photo are quite happy just wandering around, and they'll go and browse that break and then they'll go and stand off and camp. And it's quite a different scenario to intensive breaking where those cows are back fenced on a really tight piece of land. This is a photo my 15-year-old son took because he just thought it was so beautiful, but probably because he was driving the tractor. But I know there's a lot of people that would look at this photo and find the amount of dirt and bare dirt and mud maybe abhorrent. But I guess we're looking at it and thinking, wow, this is an opportunity that we've fed our animals really well, and they'll handle the rigours of winter. I mean, a well-fed animal is going to be less stressed. It can handle the cold, it can handle the wet, and that's what we're trying to do while preserving the pasture for the other times of year when we need it. Our other concern is around part of the farm. It took me a while to find this actually. For any property greater than 20 hectares that has part of the property located within the high-risk runoff zone, this rule still applies. I first have thought, surely that's misworded. They mean that out of your 10% winter feed allowance, if 20 hectares of it is within the zone, surely that's where it applies. But to me, that's not how it reads. And as an on-farm example, the Blairs at Parkhurst, Ange, they've got 1.53 hectares of their 400 hectare farm. Just a tiny little corner falls into the high-risk phosphorus zone. And according to that wording, that whole farm would then get picked up and only be allowed 20 hectares. The Peacock family, Robert here, with 4,000 hectares, the scope of their farm means that some paddocks would be hundreds of metres, if not kilometres, away from the high-risk phosphorus zone, and they will also get picked up as part of this rule. Our farm, we have slightly different geographic blocks just because of the way it got subdivided by the fathers and uncles. And we've got blocks that are down on Mayfield and Lismore soils, absolutely no risk of pea loss. And they would also get collected in this high-risk phosphorus zone. So we had some concerns about that. So what we're seeking with the high-risk phosphorus zone is that they remove the 20 hectare winter feed area as a requirement for consent and retain the proportional winter feed rule. We absolutely agree that we know it's slightly higher risk, but we know that we can manage those and that we are managing sediment losses. And the amendments are going to be pointless because we won't restrict our winter feed. We will put the winter feed in that we need to feed our animals, and that in most cases will be over 20 hectares. We think that mitigations can be demonstrated through our farm environment management plans, and we think that ECAN acknowledge that because as part of the plan change policy statement, they indicate that farming activities, blah, 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 for land with winter grazing should be able to demonstrate through their farm environment plans how they manage the loss of phosphorus. So they know that that could be done because that's what they're asking us to demonstrate. Our other point, is about offal pits. There's a wording change from in 5.24 where ECAN require at least 3 metres of soil or sand between the point of discharge, and they've changed the wording now to the highest groundwater level, in preference to the old reference which was to seasonal groundwater table. And we feel this is slightly odd because in a really high rainfall situation or after prolonged rainfall, the water table would nearly be at the surface in most situations, which means that every offal pit will not have 3 metres of soil or sand between the point of discharge and the highest groundwater level. And I'm not quite sure, but I wouldn't have thought even a composting offal pile, which sits on top of the surface and sits in sawdust, would comply, because there may not be 3 metres of soil between the two. And so, as far as I'm concerned, this new wording means that every offal pit on every farm in our group and probably our region would require consent. It seems unnecessary. So, what we're seeking, can you please retain the wording of seasonal water table with reference to offal pits? It seems more practical to us. That's generally where the water table would sit over that year, and as long as there's 3 metres between that, I can understand. But to have it that the highest water level that's ever been recorded, I'm not quite sure where you'd get that information, but that seems very blunt tool. Our other point that we're making as part of our submission is livestock exclusion, particularly with regards to intermittently flowing springs and artificial watercourses with surface water in them. As Abby mentioned, and even us down on the flats, we've got blocks where we have springs come up. They might only come up every 4 or 5 years. They might only be there for a couple of days, and quite often they move. They might come up in one part of the paddock, and then in the next large rainfall event they'll be in a slightly different point. And I'm not quite sure whether you'd call them ephemeral springs, but we'd like clarification that these lower order or lower magnitude springs will not be incorporated, particularly when they're not flowing all the time and they don't have a distinct drainage bed coming from them. We do have whole paddocks that can come up in springs depending on the rainfall at that time, and they're easy to exclude stock. We just take the stock out of that paddock for a few days. But there are other times, and I'm sure other farmers in this group have springs that would be really problematic to fence off. Drains and grassy swales, which I presume comes under artificial watercourses, that's what they were designed to do. They're designed to be a grassy swale that takes away excess water in times of excess, but for the rest of the year can be managed by grazing animals, so that you don't end up with issues of weed and pest control and fencing, etc. And in many cases, a lot of them, they may or may not, but I know one situation recently, a land management officer pointed out a puddle in a swale. It was roughly about 1 metre long, sitting in that, and he said that that would require stock exclusion because it was surface water sitting in that swale drain. I can understand if they'd call it a critical source area. I guess there's a puddle sitting in a swale, but to say that that's a surface water sitting in a swale, it's just been a little bit ambitious. And the other one we have an issue with is we'd like recognition of extreme events and floods. We know that the council monitor the river levels Last year, for example, the Te Moana River, which is very close to us, came into flood and the water was running around a foot deep down the road. And because we are on the downlands and it's gullies and swales, etc., every gully, every depression on our farm will run maybe only for 4 or 5 hours or maybe for 2 days. And in those situations, we would like some provision in the rule that says after a flood, and the council could pick a trigger, that you've got 48 hours or something where the stock exclusion rules do not apply. We don't have enough electric fence standards to run around the farm in a flood and fence off every gully that suddenly carries water. And we don't have enough paddocks that wouldn't have a gully in them to put the animals. So we'd like that one to be a bit practical, and we feel that the council know when those flood events occur and that they could put a provision indicating that there's when there's a flood, you've got so many hours after that that the stock exclusion rules do not occur. Our other is around compliance versus outcomes. We understand, and I'm not quite sure if this is correct, but at the moment ECAN don't seem to be giving out more than 4-year consents, which means that it's a pretty big outlay of money to try and do something just for 4 years. So they were used to seem to give out 10 or 15-year consents, and now they've restricted them to 4. We feel that you're looking at around $10,000 for a consent if you include the first audit. But Ashley has spent here from Peel Forest Estate, they've spent $25,000 now on getting their consent because that includes the costs of the consultant. So those costs that we've got there, the $10,000 for this compliance cost, doesn't include the farmer time or the time of the cost of the consultant if you don't feel you're capable of writing that consent application yourself. And in terms of what we think we could get for $10,000, well, we could get half a kilometre of deer fencing. And what we're trying to say is that we could actually do something with that money instead. That's what everyone wants. They want us to be actual environmental outcomes. We could buy a 4 seasons colony of dung beetles, which research has shown to reduce sediment runoff in New Zealand soils by 49 to 97%, particularly on sloping land, which absolutely covers our sort of topography that we have. We don't feel that consenting's the solution. We want to get on and do it. That's why we created an environment group, so that we can actually say, yes, this worked, get on and start doing those things. I mean, I'm not speaking for the whole group, but personally, I'd rather ECAN came to me and said, right, let's do a joint venture. We'll subsidise dung beetle and you can mitigate the risk, and as part of that joint venture, can you please provide us with your farm environment management plan so we can check that you're using the appropriate mitigation strategies to mitigate sediment loss as well. And it's a win-win. So I asked if I'm allowed to say boom at the end of that, but sorry.
You can't drop that.
Yeah, I can't drop that mic, yeah. So yeah, we thought there's other opportunities to get the environmental outcomes that people want without having to have a consent. And for 10 grand, I'm being facetious here, I could get my first ever dishwasher. I could get a bench that's high enough to put a dishwasher under. At the moment, I'm quite lucky in that it's a reasonably modern kitchen. The house is 120 years old, and luckily this kitchen was renovated 51 years ago. So the amount of money that I have spent on environmental mitigations over that time, I'm starting to resent and think I should have done my kitchen first. But at the time, I prioritised doing those because I thought I was playing the long game, and I thought it'd be nice to look out my kitchen window and see beautiful trees and gullies. So we'd like some more collaboration rather than consenting on top of those points. Ag Proud recently had a comment, don't spray out the whole paddock just to get a few pricks. Make that, we know there's going to be people out there not doing it very well, but there are people out there doing it well, and save your efforts for the ones that aren't doing it very well. Like the people who are doing it, look at their farm environment management plans and check whether they're using those mitigations, and if not, then perhaps you could look at some other amendments. We feel that at the moment this current rule makes us feel a little bit trodden down with the efforts that we've already undertaken, and a lot of the farmers in our group are starting to become a little bit exhausted by the whole compliance issue. We feel we're doing our bit, and we feel that the land management officers that we have dealings with, we've had a few, have been overwhelmingly positive. They've all come out to our farms and they said, yep, that's a great grassy margin, that's great grazing management strategies, your Olsen P levels in the right, that's, you know, you're doing all the right things, you're using the right stock classes on the right land, and yet when a policy comes out like this that seems to counteract the information we're getting from the land management officers, it's very frustrating. So they don't seem to be talking to each other. We get a really positive response from the land management officers, and then a rule comes out like this that we haven't been consulted on. We also feel there's unintended consequences that come with further compliance. For example, we're now going to have to get a consent to start maintaining our fenced off waterways. And I would have thought that a global consent issued by ECAN would have been, and we can look at doing a group consent, but it just keeps on going on and on. So we've fenced off our waterways, and now if we want to get a digger in to dig out the built up sediment, we would have to get a consent to do that. And some fails in some ways as well, we feel that the compliance is creating a feeling of intensification. We're on the verge of the 10%, but we put in Swedes and rape and lower yielding crops. Swedes are a much better protein mix for deer, say, than beet, but they are lower yielding, so you're going to need more area. But if we try and stay under the 10% rule, or a 20 hectare rule, which would be impossible, we're just going to end up putting in beet, the really, really high yielding crops, and packing on more animals on smaller areas. When in some situations you might be better to have a paddock of rape and a lower yielding crop with less stock on it, or for a shorter amount of time. So some of these things might be counterintuitive in the end. So in summary, we would recognise the high risk phosphorus zone of being of high risk of sediment loss, but we would like to remove the 20 hectare winter feed area trigger, I apologise, and retain the current proportional winter feed rule. We want to have the rules appropriate to the area of risk, not the property titles. Either the paddock is a high risk soil or it's not. We want recognition that environmental gains for sediment and pea loss are more likely to be effective using management strategies, the ones that we're already using, than amendments that restrict the amount of winter grazing, particularly when we're not going to follow that restricted amendment anyway. We know that we can demonstrate the mitigation of our pea loss in our farm environment management plans, and we know we need to do more. Like in the recent Farm Environment Plan Auditors Day, there were a couple of critical source areas that we could do more on, but generally we got a high level of confidence that what we were doing was right, and we're not even consented. We're one of these high risk sort of farms. So we'd like to retain the seasonal water table with reference to offal pits. We'd like that clarification around springs and drains, and we want ECAN to recognise that extreme events can be beyond our control with regards to stock exclusion. And we would like some of the proposals to show positives. At the moment, the way the rules are written, it makes it seem like they're all out there being really dastardly and doing horrible things to the environment, when actually the opposite is true. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, Ms. McKeown, you've given us a comprehensive range of material and information for us to consider. We thank you for that. It's obviously been well thought through, and you've presented it with spirit as well as with humour, and all of that is just fun. We have the slides that you presented the other day,
yep.
And what you've presented today is different, which has taken a bit of I don't know what, but
adjustment. Sorry.
I wonder whether you think it would be helpful to provide us with the revised set of slides, because sometimes the text is different as well as the pictures.
Yep, I can do that. Yep.
And I'll ask if my colleague has some questions to ask of you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. You said in your presentation, I think I heard you say that your farm's a dryland farm, it's not irrigated.
Yep.
Correct. Do you winter graze cattle?
Yes.
You do. And during your presentation, I was getting a mixed message about your understanding of the provision you're concerned about, Rule 14.5.17.7, the 20 hectares in area.
Yeah.
At times I thought you understood that's not an absolute limit, but other times you were speaking as if it was an absolute limit. You understand that's not an absolute limit, it just triggers you into a controlled activity consent requirement.
Yeah, that's my concern, is that it triggers us into a controlled activity consent. Yep.
So
So you can carry on over that, but we still think that it's an ineffective way to mitigate that P loss when there's other better options out there that won't require a consent.
Yeah, and so you understand that if you do have more than 20 hectares within the high runoff risk phosphorus zone, it just flips you into a controlled activity consent
Yes.
regime.
Hang on,
Yeah.
can I just have clarification there? You're saying 20 hectares within the high phosphorus risk zone.
I'm
But
just reading the words in the plan, so.
Yeah, but the plan says that if any part of our farm is identified as a high phosphorus risk zone,
The whole farm.
the whole
was.
farm. So, for example, my farm, approximately 4,000 hectares, sorry, thank you, approximately 4,000 hectares, if I have 20 hectares in one corner of the farm identified as a high phosphorus risk zone, I can either put all of that into crop for cattle with no consent needed, but 3 kilometres away on part of my same farm that is not identified as a high risk zone, I'm not allowed to put 21 hectares of crop without a consent. That is the issue.
So if you do flip into a controlled activity consenting regime, you said you already have farm environment plans that were either done with a beef and lamb template or a deer industry
Yeah.
template.
But my understanding is they are farm environment management plans because there's no nutrient budget necessarily with them. Whereas at the moment, if you require a consent, you'd have to go get the nutrient budget as well.
So that's an additional concern, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe that the condition of the consent is that you have to provide a farm environment plan with the nutrient budget as part of that consent requirement.
And of course, you talk about stock exclusion a little bit too, and we've referred to the national regulations. You're aware that as of 1 July 2025, you're going to have to fence off your 1 metre wide streams
Dealing
on
with
your flat land.
one issue at a time, I guess.
So, I mean, that's coming anyway,
Yeah, it
regardless
is
of what the
regardless.
regional plans
But at the same time, it's nice to have this clarification now because we don't know what's coming in the future. And while that legislation is coming, ECAN can go greater than that if they wanted. So we're asking them to be practical now and apply what's necessary later.
What do you mean greater?
My understanding is that ECAN the legislation will be the minimum of what they need to do.
ECAN can have a stricter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
have a stricter.
Yeah.
Can't
Yes.
have a less strict rule.
No, so
No.
that's what I'm saying. So ECAN require more than the legislation. So we're saying if they clarify it now, then it's less likely that they're going to be stricter than the legislation.
Right, and I think that's clarified the only things I wasn't sure about, so thank you.
Thanks.
So we've had Ms. Brance and we've had Ms. McKeown's presentation as well. Is there anyone else who's going to be speaking in respect of this group?
No.
Well, our purpose, as I think you know, is to be looking for improvements that we can recommend to ECAN about their plan change. And it's quite clear from what you've been telling us this afternoon that there's many improvements that are relevant to your areas of interest. And so you've been right on the mark, and we're grateful to you for coming in and preparing as thoroughly as you have. And it will be looking for improvements that we can recommend that will be occupying us And we're not concerned, we don't have anything to do with how council officers behave, and some of them are cooperative and some of them seem not to be cooperative. That's outside our area altogether. But very many thanks to you all for coming in and taking part in the hearing where we're looking for improvements. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Fernando, is there any further business for us this afternoon?
No, it's not, Commissioner Shepherd.
And tomorrow morning we have a break, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so that we'll sit again tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock, is it?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then that's where we have Mr. Morrison and others to follow.
Yes.
All right. Well, the hearing's adjourned till 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon then.